All right, it's 4 o'clock. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Good, good, good to hear. UCS Day, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it picked a great the weather picked a great day to no longer have hell on earth, and so hopefully everyone have fun at UCS Day today. All right, so the topic for today, this is kind of the last of our kind of I would say kind of tissue kind of conceptual kind of lectures. So we're talking about joints today, right? So we've talked about bones, muscles, and so kind of the last thing that we need to cover before we get into kind of the meat and potatoes of the class is talking about joints, right? And so again, the kind of the reason we're doing this, I know on the one hand, some of you may find it really interesting to kind of have all these kind of biologically kind of themed lectures. But on the other hand, I can see it can be kind of boring a little bit too, just because we haven't been doing any calculations or cool stuff. But a lot of this information is kind of necessary to kind of set the background or kind of set the context for a lot of what we're going to cover, a lot of the calculations that we're going to do in the weeks to come. But today should be the last of it, and then next week we're going to start talking about the upper body, doing some problems with that and talking about that in particular. Okay. All right. Any questions I can answer before we get started for today? Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. And so today we're doing joint biomechanics. Okay. So, this is kind of the, like I just mentioned, we've covered bones. Bones, of course, are very important tissue in your body, especially when it comes to human movement. Muscles, obviously very important too. Joints are not actually a type of tissue themselves. And so, you don't have a joint, a joint type of tissue in your body. So when I refer to joints, what I mean is kind of the articulations or the meetings between different bones in your body. So whenever two different bones meet, the location of where they meet, that's called a joint. Okay. Another thing that joints are useful for is that they kind of locate the locations. They're kind of the marker where the body transitions from one segment to the other. Okay? So the different segments in the body are separated by the joints. Okay? So joints are really important. And so, even though they're not, strictly a type of tissue themselves, probably the most interesting kind of biomechanics and the most interesting geometries occur at the joints. Okay. Because depending on how a joint is structured, depending on how it's designed, that really kind of determines the type of motion that your body is able to do. Okay. There's a big difference in the type of motion that's allowed at your shoulder joint when compared to, let's say your ankle joint, right? And all that is really just due to the geometry and the structure of the joints there, okay? And when I talk about structure, not only do I mean just the geometry of the bones, although that does play a very big impact, but the joints are also where, all these kind of soft tissues kind of gather as well. So all of the ligaments and all the tendons as well, right? So the exact kind of structure of how those ligaments and tendons and muscles, how all of those arrange at the joints, really play a really big impact in terms of the motion that you can do. Okay. Okay. And so when talking about joints, at least from kind of a biomechanics and from a clinical perspective, we're mostly interested in kind of two things, and these two things are very closely related to each other. And so we're interested in one, the stability of the joint. So we'll spend a fair bit amount of time today talking about what that means. And the other thing that we're interested in the joint is flexibility. In some ways, you can see that these as opposites, and so kind of the general trend that you'll see in your body is that the joints that are highly stable are the ones that are very inflexible, and kind of vice versa. The joints in your body that are highly flexible generally have lower stability, although there's variations on that range as well. But when you're talking about kind of joint health and kind of the biomechanics of the joints, these are kind of the two main things that we're going to talk about. Okay. Okay. So that's kind of where we're going for today. Any questions on this so far? Okay, cool. All right, so let's talk about the types of joints in the body. Okay. So generally speaking, the characterization that we use for joints is we define them based on the type of movement that they allow. So there are some joints in the body that allow basically no movement at all. So there are a lot of connections between bones in your body that don't, that really don't allow any movement. Versus joints that allow a huge range of motion, like your shoulder joint. Okay. So let's go from least mobile to most mobile. Right? So the least mobile joint in your body are called the immovable joints. And so just like their name implies, these joints allow basically no movement between the articulating bones. And so the reason for this, in large part is the geometry. So, a lot of these joints have bones that just geometrically just cannot move really past each other. But also a lot of these joints have a lot of cartilage and a lot of kind of ligaments around them that prevent any kind of movement. So the main role for these types of joints is to mostly just absorb impacts. And so just to kind of give a place where, there might be a little bit of movement, maybe some jiggling in between them. And that's mostly just to make sure that, impacts can kind of be absorbed in a safe way. So some examples of immovable joints in your body. Remember from the second day of class, we talked about how your skull is actually made up of lots of different bones that move around a lot in your in your youth, but once you become an adult, they kind of become settled. So after a while, there's a lot of cartilage and a lot of kind of fibrous tissue that kind of prevents your skull bones from sliding past each other. Okay, which is good. Your skull is kind of a helmet that protects your brain. Another example could be in either your lower arm or your lower leg. And so remember, you have two bones in your lower arm, the radius and the ulna. You have two bones in your lower leg, which is the tibia and the fibula. Those bones aren't also designed to move past each other. A lot of the bones in your ribs also kind of fall in this category too. So those bones aren't really meant to move. They're mostly just there to absorb force. Okay. And so the type of joint that comes after immovable joints are the slightly movable joints. I'm not kidding. That's what they're named. Okay. So these joints, just like the immovable joints, they do have a lot of cartilage, but they allow a little bit of movement in addition to, being mostly there to absorb force. So some examples of these could be the joints in your vertebrae. And so your vertebrae is comprised of all these bones that are kind of stacked on top of each other. For the most part, they don't really move past each other, but they do allow kind of slight rotation. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to bend your back at all. And so, that slight movement there is necessary. Okay. Question in the chat. BW means between. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then moving right along. The next category. So, even though there's those first two types of joints, we're obviously not going to talk about them too much in this class just because, there's no movement there. But in reality, the majority of the joints in your body kind of belong to these two here, either immovable joints or slightly movable joints. Just because there's so many bones in your body, and for the most part, they don't really have a lot of interesting movement between them. But it is important to kind of characterize those joints. Okay. So this third category, when people say joint, this is probably what they are thinking of in their minds. These are the freely movable joints. Right. And so just like the name implies, these types of joints allow a large range of motion between the articulating bones. Okay. And they allow for so much motion that it actually requires some lubrication. So there is what's called a synovial membrane that allows these bones to move past each other with minimal friction. Okay. So these are joints like your shoulder joint, your elbow joint, your knee joint, your ankle joint. So these are the ones that are mostly associated with human movement. Okay. And so, of course, this category here is the one we're going to focus on, and we can actually further break this down into the types of movements that are allowed, because the movement that is allowed at your elbow joint is different from the motion that's in your shoulder joint. So let's further kind of break this down. I'm not going to list all of them. There's quite a few of them, but I think it's important to kind of talk about kind of the most important ones. So again, kind of listing these from kind of, least mobile to most mobile. Let's start with the gliding joint. And so gliding joint, these occur between bones that are mostly flat, and they allow for motion of the bones to kind of slide towards each other, away from each other, and past each other. And when I say gliding, what I mean is translational motion. Okay. For the most part, most of the joints that we're going to talk about allow for rotational motion. And so we're going to be doing a lot of kind of rotational kinematics, rotational, forces, things like that. Gliding joints are unique in that they actually allow translational motion. And the area of your body where this is kind of most prevalent, or where you're going to see most of the gliding joints, these are going to be in your hand and in your foot. Okay. So all your carpal bones and your tarsal bones. Okay. Okay. Next one to go over, let's do the hinge joint. Hinge joint is the favorite joint that we'll be doing a lot in this class, just because the motion is completely 2D, easy to draw. Okay. All right, so for a hinge joint, the articulating bones literally kind of form a hinge, and they allow for 1 degree of rotation. Okay. So a lot of the joints in your body kind of fall into this category, and so we have your elbow joint, very famous hinge joint. The knee joint, and the knee joint is a little bit more complicated, but most of its motion is hinge-like. Okay. And another really common one is your fingers. And so your fingers are also kind of hinge joints. They can only kind of rotate in one plane. Okay. And same for your toes. All right. Another one that's interesting is a pivot joint. Okay. And so just like a hinge joint, the pivot joint only allows for rotation along one axis. Okay. The big difference is that the axis that you're rotating around for a pivot joint is parallel to a bone rather than perpendicular to them. Okay. a lot of the pivot joints in your body also allow for some degree of hinge motion as well, so kind of extension and contraction. So some common examples of this, probably the two most notable ones are your wrist joint and your neck joint. All right, and the last one that we'll go over, there's different categorizations of this one just because there's, and they're categorized based on how much motion they allow, but they're all kind of relatively the same, which is called the ball and socket joint. And so in this case, the articulating bones kind of have I would say one of them looks like a ball, so one of them is kind of spherical in nature, and the other one kind of forms a socket for that ball to kind of rotate around. Okay. And this allows kind of the greatest degree of freedom. So oftentimes this means rotation in all three planes. Okay. Not full rotation in all three planes, but somewhat constrained, but it is possible to kind of get rotation in all three principal planes. And some examples of this, two joints that we're going to talk about a lot today is the hip joint and the shoulder joint. Both are characterized as ball and socket joints. Okay. And another one that's not strictly ball and socket, it technically belongs to another category, but it's practically a ball and socket joint, is your thumb. Okay. Opposable thumb, the thing that has allowed humans to evolve past all the other animals, is our ability to just pick things up off the ground. Yeah. So technically, your thumb joint is categorized as a saddle joint, but its motion is very close to ball and socket. So I'm kind of lumping them together here. Okay. So I know that took a while. That was kind of a lot of definitions, but it's important to kind of know these characterizations because it's important to know kind of what kind of motion a joint is capable of. Because if you're designing devices or you're analyzing devices that are meant to either add stability to a joint or affect a joint in a certain way, knowing the type of motion that's allowed there is a really important design consideration. Okay. So I'll give you an example of a device. My dad uses this all the time. Is a knee brace. Okay. And so if you've ever seen someone wear a knee brace, it's kind of like a sleeve that goes around your knee. Sometimes they have some kind of metal appendages that kind of attach to it as well. Okay. And what a knee brace is designed to do is that it's designed to add stability to the knee joint. Okay? Because what we know is that a knee joint is designed to be a hinge joint, and so it's only supposed to kind of rotate in one direction. And so the purpose of a knee brace is to kind of help prevent motion of the knee in any other kind of directions that would likely cause injury. Okay. All right. And so if we're looking at a person's knee from the front, right? Right. So this is a person's knee from the front. The motion of the knee, if you're looking at the knee from the front, is that it kind of rotates, at least from this perspective, it rotates towards you and it rotates away from you. Okay. And so it's not designed to bend this way at all, right? If your knee bends that way, then you're probably in for a lot of pain. And so a knee brace is designed to kind of go over the knee like this, okay? And oftentimes it will have some kind of supporting plates kind of on the side like that, okay? And the idea is that, with these kind of supporting plates, or maybe the material that's used, or maybe it grips it really tightly, it prevents motion in directions that the knee's not supposed to bend, okay? And that's really important for the knee because, depending on how the person walks, or maybe they're playing a contact sport, or maybe they're, doing some activity, it's very common for the knee to kind of absorb loads in directions that's not supposed to, okay? And so you'll see, people that play, football wear knee braces a lot too, because just the nature of football, people are tackling you from all different directions, right? You're going to sustain loads in directions that the knee's not really designed to do, right? And so let's say if someone tackles you from the side, if your knee kind of bends the wrong way, you're going to sprain your knee and you're going to get injured, okay? And so to kind of prevent that, that knee brace is there to kind of add stability and kind of, either attenuate the load, absorb the load, or, basically prevent that. Okay. And so if you go to, if you go to a company that designs these knee braces, they have a very kind of, intimate understanding of how the knee is supposed to bend, and kind of the most common ways that people can kind of injure themselves. And they've designed their knee brace to kind of help prevent that. All right, any questions on this? Yeah.
Would you back?
Oh, yeah.
Or is it just like, like a bunch of those ones all put together?
Oh, yeah. So your back, yeah, technically there's a joint between each of your vertebrate bones. But typically when people refer to back injuries, it's kind of the connection between your vertebrae and your pelvis bone. So that's the joint that kind of gets the most hurt.
I know that there's like different sections to your back. Is that split up by different mobility? Like the different joints?
So the different sections, they're mostly based on the curvature of the spine. So the spine kind of makes this kind of S shape, and so whenever the curvature kind of changes direction, that's a different section of the spine. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right, any other questions on this? Okay. All right. So now that we know kind of the types of joints that are out there, let's start kind of quantifying some things about the joint. So let's start with stability. Okay. So when we refer to joint stability, what we're referring to is the ability of the joint to resist dislocation, or basically the ability of the joint to kind of stay in the way that it's designed to do. Right? think if we have time at the end of class, we'll talk a bit about joint injuries or kind of injuries that can occur at the joints. So dislocation is one of the big ones that you're concerned about, right? Dislocation refers to, if the bones kind of pop out of the joint and kind of, get separated from each other. Okay. So if a joint is measured based on stability and how well it can resist this. Okay. Okay. So the factors that kind of affect joint stability, there's quite a few. Okay. The first factor is just simply the geometry of the joint itself, and so how the bones, literally kind of fit into each other. Okay. The way some certain bones fit together just naturally forms a much more stable joint. We'll see that when we compare the hip joint to the shoulder joint. Okay. Another factor is just the arrangement of all of the ligaments in the area. Okay. If you recall, ligaments are soft tissues in your body that connect one bone to another. Okay. So in most joints in your body, there's, that's kind of where all the ligaments live, right? And so some joints have a lot of support from the ligaments. Some joints don't have a lot of support from the ligaments. So depending on how many ligaments there are and how strong they are, how they're arranged, that's going to affect the stability of the joint as well. Right? And the third one is the strength and the amount of muscles in the area as well. And so I think, we mentioned that at the end of class on Monday that, a lot of these joints have muscles that cross over the joint. And a lot of times these muscles have the kind of the secondary role of kind of pushing the joints close to each other, right? And that kind of adds stability to the joints. Okay. So generally speaking, if you're relatively physically active and your muscles are in good shape, then, that only adds to your, your joint stability. Okay. Yeah, question.
This is kind of a random question that's popped in my head, but so when you think about like a slip disc,
Mhm.
is that, you consider that a form of dislocation?
It is. And so a slip disc, you're referring to like the vertebrates in your back. Yeah, so it is considered a dislocation, depends on the severity. But a lot of times, there's kind of this material kind of in between the vertebrae. And so a slip disc can oftentimes just be that material is just kind of slipping out. It's kind of this like fibrous kind of material, but for severe kind of slip disc, then the vertebrae might also kind of shear past each other. Yeah. Yeah. So all of these factors can affect stability. Let's go through kind of these kind of one by one. Okay. Okay. So for the geometry of the articulating bones, the factor that is most correlated with stability is contact area. Okay. Generally, the more contact area that there is between the bones at the joint, the more stable it's going to be. Okay. Okay. So let me give you a couple of examples of two joints that have very similar motions, and in fact, they perform very similar roles, whereas one joint is considered probably the most stable joint in the body, whereas the other joint is probably the least stable joint in the body. Okay. So let's talk about the hip joint versus the shoulder joint. Okay. So both of these joints kind of play similar roles in the body, and so they're kind of responsible for connecting your limb to your torso, basically. So your hip joint is the connection between your legs and your and your pelvis, and then your shoulder joint is the connection between your arm and your upper torso. Okay. They're both ball and socket joints, and so they both have a large degree of range of motion. But whenever you hear people get a dislocation, almost never do you hear someone say that they dislocated their hip, unless something kind of really terrible happened, like they get into a car accident or something. But whereas all the time, you hear people dislocate their shoulder. In fact, people have the uncanny talent to dislocate their shoulder themselves and then pop it back in, which is kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies a little bit. But the shoulder is a lot easier to dislocate. And their difference, and of course, there's differences in the muscles that surround these joints. There's differences in ligaments, but the main difference between these two joints is just how well the bones kind of fit into each other. Okay, so let's talk about the hip joint first. Okay, so the hip joint is the joint between your femur and your pelvis bone. Okay, and so the femur has this very kind of iconic feature to it called the head of the femur. It's this. It literally just kind of looks like a bone at the end of a stick. Okay, and so geometrically, it kind of looks like this. All right. Whoever was kind of came up with the names of all the joints and they thought of ball and socket joint, this is what they thought. This is the ball in ball and socket. All right. It turns out in your pelvis bone, there is a perfect slot for this femoral head. Okay. And so I should have drawn it a little bit down there. Actually, let me do that. That was actually a pretty good femoral head. I'm so sad to erase it. That was not bad too. Okay, so that's the head of your femur. And so inside your pelvic bone, there's literally a socket for it that it almost kind of wraps around the entire kind of head, right? And so it kind of comes in like this. It almost kind of like pinches. And so, there's this neck right here, right? And so the pelvis bone almost kind of like pinches the femoral head kind of right there. And so, to draw it kind of a bit more accurately, may look kind of something like that. And so if you look at this, right, and so if you look at the amount of contact area between the femoral head and the pelvis bone, you basically have all of this area right here. Right? Your pelvis bone provides a very, very deep socket for the femur to kind of fit into. Okay. And so even just looking at this, if you were to try to dislocate this, right, if you were to try to yank out the femur from the socket, it looks like it would be kind of hard because this opening right here is quite small, and that femoral head is kind of bigger than that hole. Okay? And so because it's so hard to kind of dislocate this because of the geometry, the hip joint is considered probably the most stable joint in the body, which is kind of amazing considered how much range of motion you have at your hip as well. Okay. In contrast, for your shoulder joint is the connection between your upper arm bone, your humerus, and your basically your clavicle, or excuse me, not your clavicle, your shoulder joint, the bone there. I forgot, the name escapes me right now. Okay. So similar to the femur, right? Your humerus also has kind of a fairly large ball, but it's not as prominent as the femur. I always forget how to spell humerus. I think there's no level. Okay, now it looks like hummus. Okay, so the humerus, it has a ball at the end. It's not as prominent, but it kind of looks like that. Okay. And so you can kind of see right away that there's not as big of a bone that the humerus is providing there. Okay. But the main thing that makes the shoulder joint unstable is kind of the socket that it fits into. Okay. So there's kind of a small cavity where this fits into. Okay. And it's a little bit hard to draw kind of in 2D, but it kind of looks like that. Okay. And so this cavity has a name, right? So the part where the humerus attaches to your torso, this is called the glenoid fossa. Okay. And it's a very, very narrow kind of socket. In fact, if you look at it, you wouldn't even think that it's a socket to begin with. It kind of just looks like a small indent in that bone. Okay. So this part right here is very shallow. And so if you kind of look at just the geometry of these two bones here, you can see that it's going to be much easier to dislocate your shoulder just because there's a lot less geometrical resistance to doing that. Okay. But in contrast, even though the hip joint is a ball and socket joint, it is quite flexible, but it doesn't really compare to the range of motion that's allowed at the shoulder joint. So the shoulder joint, you kind of trade a little bit of stability for a lot of flexibility or range of motion. The shoulder might be the joint with the largest range of motion at the bottom. Yeah, I can't think of a joint that has more. All right, any questions on this? All right. So generally speaking, more contact area, more surface area leads to more stability. Okay, and that trend is kind of pretty consistent among the bones in your body. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that the contact area, even though a lot of it is driven by the geometry of the bones, there's ways that you can kind of dynamically adjust the contact area at your joints. So we touched on this a little bit last time that, basically through the actions of your muscles, you can kind of literally kind of push the bones at the joints closer together. In fact, we have terms that can characterize this. Okay? And so if you use your muscle to kind of push the bones together, what you're effectively doing is you're increasing the surface area. We call that a closed packed position. And then the opposite of that is a loose pack position. And so in loose pack position, it's very rare for muscles to kind of pull your joints apart. I think probably the only case where that's true is at your shoulder joint, where people can willingly kind of dislocate their shoulder themselves. Most of your joints aren't designed like that. But basically, in a loose pack position, somehow the articulating bones are being pulled apart, usually through some kind of external force or external influence, and it decreases the stability of the joint. So one kind of really interesting example of this is your ankle joint. And so the ankle joint is a very frequent site of injury. So people sprain their ankles all the time. If you play sports, you probably sprain your ankle at some point. Even just people just walking around or just going down stairs in a weird way, you'll sprain your ankle. Okay. But the ankle joint is one where you can really affect the stability of the joint based on, based on the position of your foot. Okay. So let's look at two situations. So let's look at dorsiflexion of the ankle joint. And so if you remember from our anatomy lecture, this is when you kind of bring your toes upwards. Okay. And then the opposite of that is plantar flexion. So plantar flexion is when you point your toes towards the ground. Okay. So your foot kind of rotates down. Okay. So your ankle joint is kind of the articulation between your two lower leg bones, so your fibula and your tibia. Okay. So you have kind of bones that kind of come in like this. Okay. Pretend that there's two of them, the other one's just behind it. Okay. And then that's the articulation with kind of your foot bone. Okay. Okay. So kind of logic kind of tells us that, any kind of motion that pushes these bones closer together is going to increase the stability. Okay. In fact, someone actually measured this, and so they actually had people in the X-rays kind of point their toes up and point their toes down, and they were able to kind of measure how much contact or the apparent contact area between the bones. Okay. And so what they found is that in dorsiflexion, on average, and this was a study in 2006 by a scientist called Millington. Okay. And so in dorsiflexion, what they found was that the contact area was about 7.34 with a standard deviation of 1.69 centimeters square. Okay. Whereas in plantar flexion, the contact area was a lot less. And so this was about 4.34 with a standard deviation of 1.41 centimeters square. Okay. I don't have much on the nature of the study, so I don't know how many people they measured, but if it's published, then assume that they were able to find kind of statistical significance with this. Okay. And so what does this tell us? And so, based on what we know about joint stability, this tells us that your ankle joint is a lot more vulnerable in the plantar flexion state. Okay. And that makes a lot of sense. And so if you think about, if you've ever sprained your ankle before, and so, try to think back to that time. If you're like me, I sprained my ankle a bunch growing up, right? It was almost always in a situation where my foot was coming back down to the ground, right? And so if you kind of, think about when you're walking, right? And so when you're walking or you're running, one foot is on the ground, the other one foot is in the air, right? As you're kind of taking a step. Usually you kind of sprain your ankle when your foot is coming back down, right? Either when you're running or maybe you're jumping, you're coming back down to the ground, right? And so naturally what your foot does when you're kind of coming down is that you kind of point your toes towards the ground like that, right? And so, for the most part, when people sprain their ankle, they get their ankle injured. It's because their foot's coming down and it's in that plantar flexion state. Okay? Same thing when you're kind of walking downstairs. When you're, it's a lot more common for people to injure themselves walking downstairs rather than upstairs. Because in upstairs, you're kind of, you kind of have to bring your foot up, and your foot is kind of more naturally in this dorsiflexion position. Whereas if you're going downstairs, you kind of point your toes downwards more, and you kind of decrease that contact. All right. Any questions on this? Yeah.
So going back to the close pack and loose pack position, given your femoral head, so like say, you think about like deep tissue, so you get you like your psoas muscle release. Is that an example of close pack or loose pack?
It's more in terms of how the joint is kind of be pushed together. And so, kind of in the simplest case, you can imagine it as like kind of compression versus tension. It's not as simple as that in a lot of cases because the muscles don't run perfectly parallel to the bones. But if you're in a position where the bones are kind of being pushed together, that's a closed pack position. And then if they're being kind of pulled apart, that's a loose pack position. Yeah. Sometimes gravity plays a role too. Like for the ankle joint, most of the times you're going to be in plantar flexion because gravity kind of naturally kind of pushes your toes downwards when it's off the ground too. So that plays a role too. Any other questions on this? Okay. All right, I do want to get to flexibility today because I do kind of want to finish up these lecture notes. But let me just make a quick note about the knee. All right, so the knee joint is actually quite unique in that it's a joint that's almost completely made up of the ligaments. So some joints derive the majority of their stability from the ligaments that connect the bones at the joints. Okay. And so the knee joint is kind of the prime example of this. Because if you look at kind of the geometry of the bone at the knee, it looks like a very unstable joint, right? And so the knee joint is the connection basically between your femur, the lower end of the femur, and then kind of the tibia. And so the tibia kind of has this like shelf that kind of the knee kind of sits on. I'm ignoring the patella for a second. And so this is the bottom of the femur. And the tibia kind of makes this kind of like shelf right here. And they're actually kind of far apart, relative to a lot of the joints in your body. And so these two, they do make contact sometimes, but in kind of a perfect resting state with no gravity or anything involved, they can be actually quite far. And if you look at their surfaces, that shelf right there, that platform for the tibia, there's not really any kind of socket or any kind of, indent in there for the femur to kind of rest into. Right? It is kind of U-shaped, and so, there is kind of a part that's kind of cut out right here. But for the most part, there's nothing really for it to kind of sit into. So what is providing stability for the knee, right? The knee, I would say, for the most part, is considered a fairly stable joint. The reason the knee is very stable is because it has a very complex network of ligaments that protect it. And so there's kind of two ligaments that kind of sit, that kind of run on the outside of the knee joint. Okay. One is the MCL. It doesn't really matter which is which. Okay. MCL stands for medial collateral ligament. And so that's the ligament that's on kind of the inner side of your knee. And the other is the LCL. So that's the lateral collateral ligament. Okay. And then there's also two ligaments that kind of run on the inside. And so there is one that kind of runs from front to back. And so that's kind of hard to illustrate here. So this is the ACL. Okay. That stands for anterior cruciate ligament. And the other one is the PCL. So that stands for posterior cruciate. And so the combination of all these ligaments, and these ligaments are quite strong too. And so, they have a lot of strength. They can withstand a lot of load. These are the ones that kind of give stability to the knee. Okay. All right. So we'll get into the knee joint a lot more once we start talking about kind of the lower body, the lower extremity. But I just kind of wanted to make the point that some joints are kind of held together mostly by the ligaments. And the articulating bones don't really contribute all that much. Okay, any questions on this? Okay. All right, so for the last 15 minutes today, let's talk about joint flexibility. Okay, so joint flexibility refers to the range of motion or the amount of motion that's allowed at the joint. And this is separate from the type of joint that we've talked about earlier, right? So each joint has kind of a set amount of movements that are allowed, right? So a hinge joint can only rotate in one plane generally. Ball and socket joints can rotate in a lot of other planes, pivot joints. And so this is not talking about that. And so, once the motion is defined, right, the type of motion, the joint flexibility defines, how much you can actually, move in those specified directions. So i.e. All right. And so there's two types of flexibilities that are referred to medically. And so the first type is a static flexibility. So static flexibility is the amount of motion or the range of motion possible when your joint or when your bones are moved by some external force. And so if you've ever had a friend, or if you've ever had, someone or a trainer or something, stretch out one of your joints, and so basically your own muscles aren't involved at all. You're kind of passively kind of sitting there. That is static flexibility. And so in static flexibility, your own muscles aren't involved at all. When you stretch yourself, and so when you use your own muscles to kind of stretch out the joint, and to see how much range of motion you have that way, that's called dynamic flexibility. So generally speaking, static flexibility is usually higher. Usually you get a larger range of motion when you have some outside agent kind of helping you stretch. Just because a lot of times a lot of joints are crossed over by multiple muscles, and if one muscle is kind of engaged, it kind of limits how much flexibility that joint can have. Okay. And so if your muscles are relaxed, then it's usually a lot easier to kind of stretch a joint or stretch a muscle. But both are important. So however much flexibility you have through your own power versus someone else, both of these are important. Okay, and they measure different things too. And so static flexibility, oftentimes trainers will do that, or physical therapists may do that just to assess, how healthy your bones are, how healthy your ligaments are, if you have pain at all, right? And so that can be used to assess things like arthritis or sprains or ligament damage, whereas dynamic flexibility kind of is more of a test on your own muscles. Okay, so both of these are kind of important factors, and they kind of measure different things. Okay. Okay. So how is joint flexibility measured, right? We talk a lot about stability, but stability is kind of it's almost kind of like a qualitative thing, but flexibility is actually something we can actually measure. And so since, most of the motion that your body can do is rotational in nature, we use rotational kind of kinematics to measure flexibility. And so flexibility is often measured using angles or degrees. Or if you want to be a mathematician, you can use radians too, I guess. But most people use degrees. Okay. And so, the angle that I'm referring to here is the angle between basically two articulating bones. And in fact, this is a quantity that we're going to be talking about a lot later, especially once we get into kind of human motion, human dynamics. And so this particular angle is called the joint angle. So for example, if you want to measure hip flexibility, one way that you could do that is you can have a person lay flat, okay? And then they can kind of stick one leg into the air like this. And the other leg can kind of be sitting down on the ground. It's late, okay? I know it's a really deformed foot. I know one leg is longer than the other one. I realize that, okay? All right, and so the joint angle for the hip would be this angle right here, right? So you're taking the angle between basically one femur and the other femur. Okay? All right. So there's lots of ways to measure this. Kind of the most traditional way is that a physical therapist may use a device called the goniometer. And so a goniometer is literally just a giant protractor that kind of has two kind of arms to it. And so it's kind of the old school way to do it. But a lot of times nowadays, especially if you're doing kind of motion analysis of someone, these joint angles are measured using a motion capture. And so we'll be talking about motion capture technology and how we can get things like joint angles, joint velocity, joint accelerations from that. Okay. So the reason joint flexibility is often an area of interest when you're talking about biomechanics is that joint flexibility is often strongly correlated to injury risk. And so you may be wondering, is it better to have a large amount of flexibility or is it better to have less flexibility, right? Because we've already kind of talked about that flexibility is kind of almost the opposite of stability, where if you have a very kind of lax joint, if you have a very kind of flexible joint, it kind of implies that it might be easier to dislocate. But actually, the most optimal amount of flexibility is kind of in a Goldilocks region between too much and too little. Okay? And so kind of let's talk about the extremes. And so if your joint flexibility is too low, and so let's say you go to a physical therapist and they measure the flexibility of your joints, and you're not getting the range of motion that most people are, okay? Or if you're like me and you've never been able to accomplish the sit and reach drill, right? What this can imply is that, first of all, you're probably not as physically active as you need to. And therefore, a lot of the muscles and the ligaments and the tendons are kind of tight and kind of brittle. Okay? And so, we've probably all experienced that at some point. Your muscles are just really tight, right? And so kind of the risk is that when you have really tight muscles or ligaments or tendons, that if you do kind of expose it to a very large motion, right away, it doesn't have the elasticity or the flexibility to accomplish that. And then you just end up with torn muscle tissue. Okay. That's why, before you do any kind of physical activity, people always tell you that you should stretch, right? When you stretch, what you're doing is that you're kind of, slowly kind of, ramping up the flexibility of your joints, the flexibility of your muscles, getting blood flow in there, hydrating your muscles, hydrating your tendons and ligaments to allow for greater kind of flexibility. Right? And on the other side of the spectrum, if your flexibility is too high, what that means is that your body is kind of capable of motions or range of motion that will put you more at risk for dislocations. And so in these kind of situations, your bones may be put in kind of very unstable positions, very loose packed configurations. And the main risk at that point is dislocations. Okay. And so generally, flexibility, when your flexibility is too high, what that means that your muscles and your ligaments and tendons, they aren't able to support, the amount of force that they need to. So they're kind of just lax right there. Okay. All right. Any final questions on this before we wrap it up? Okay. All right. So that's all we got time for today. And so when we come back on Monday, we will start talking about the upper extremity. And so we'll actually start to do some actual real calculations. So that'll be exciting. So thank you guys for coming today. Thankfully it's cooler today, and so hopefully it's more easier to kind of do activities outside. So hope you guys have a good rest of your day. Hope you guys have a good weekend, and I will see you on Monday. What's that? Yeah. Yeah, so 3 point, 3 point is somewhere that's off one of the constraints. And so, our constraints normally we draw kind of lines for them. So 3 point is just if it's as long as it's not sitting on one constraint. But a bound point is one with it's like right on the. Oh. Yep.